Even when the guns are silent and the war is long over, the traces of the bloody battles are still visible long afterward. The objects recovered later often bear witness to the unimaginable suffering that men and women had to endure at the front. However, it sometimes happens that finds turn up in places we never expected. Have you ever heard of the war veteran in a chimney? If you want to know which extraordinary military discoveries immediately made the headlines, you should definitely stay tuned now. But before we get into it, be sure to hit the like button and ring the notification bell for more videos. Submarine in Milan. A few years ago, people in downtown Milan were amazed. A submarine broke through the street near the famous cathedral, so it wasn't long before several reporters and rescue teams flocked to the lost submarine. A car was also damaged in the incredible accident. As the sailors climbed out of the craft and the captain stammered a few confused words into the microphone, a fundamental question arose. How did this happen? The wildest speculation about the incident soon circulated online. But was this really a top-secret government mission gone awry? A little later, it became clear. No, the whole thing had nothing to do with a secret military operation. In truth, the alleged accident was a staged PR campaign by an Italian insurance company. In this way, the group wanted to make its customers aware that literally anything can happen, and that the insurance company will take effect even in such curious case. In detail, the campaign was preceded by a months-long planning phase, and there is no question that the idiosyncratic advertising coup was successful in view of the countless headlines. $1 Million Point. The story of $1 Million Point is as curious as it is incomprehensible. For example, off the South Pacific island of Espiritu Santo, there is a sea area in which vast quantities of vehicles, construction machinery, and other material are slumbering. However, all these objects did not fall into the ocean as part of a massive battle. Rather, they are the result of a peculiar austerity measure. During the Second World War, the Americans had several million tons of material brought to the island in order to supply their South Pacific armed forces from there. The problem is that those responsible had calculated the required amount far too generously, so things were piling up on the island after the end of the war. However, since it would have been extremely expensive to return $4 billion worth of cargo to the United States, all the equipment was dumped at sea. Particularly bitter, 90% of the items had no military background and could actually have been used by the local population. Since the value of the gear thrown into the water is said to be in the millions these days, the popular dive site is known as $1 Million Point. Mysterious Box. After the Second World War, many Nazis tried to make everything that suggested their sentiments disappear. So, to avoid being charged, some high-ranking party members buried the explosive evidence deep underground. However, one case that happened in Russia seems particularly puzzling. In 2016, detectorists came across an old box there that contained the belongings of a former Wehrmacht soldier. In addition to the NSDAP membership card and parts of the uniform, cigars and rum were also stored in the box. What ultimately led to the personal belongings being hidden in Russia will probably forever remain a mystery of the past. FM-2 WILDCAT. As is well known, the horrors of World War II were never able to reach the American mainland. But then how is it possible that an FM-2 WILDCAT slumbered at the bottom of Lake Michigan for nearly 70 years? Well, actually, the plane didn't fall victim to enemy fire. It was rather a failed training mission that landed it in the watery grave. Back then, in December 1944, the machine should have landed on an aircraft carrier after a routine flight. However, the pilot William Forbes missed his target and crashed into the water. Luckily, he would survive the wet crash landing unscathed. Forbes later claimed that the engine failed during the approach for the landing. Anyway, in 2012, the machine was finally recovered and restored by a military enthusiast. Tiny submarine. In June 1942, The Japanese took control of the small island of Kishka. The occupiers managed to hold the island, which belongs to the Aleutian Group, for more than 1 year before it fell into the hands of the Americans and Canadians without a fight. The amount of equipment still found on Kishka today adds a surreal touch to the natural landscape panorama. Incidentally, among the rusting cannons and shipwrecks lies a tiny Type A submarine. These squat mini-submarines, which are just 1.85 meters wide, only had room for 2 men. They were used, among other things, in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Enigma. For a long time, the Enigma encryption machine was considered unbreakable. In the belief that the enemy would not be able to decode the cryptic messages, the Wehrmacht, the secret services, and the police relied on this ingenious invention. What the Nazis did not know at the time, however, was that a team led by British mathematician Alan Turing had succeeded in developing the so-called Turing bomb, which was capable of deciphering the Enigma code. From 1940 onwards, the Allies were able to continuously follow the Germans' movements. Historians estimate that the Germans manufactured around 40,000 Enigma machines at the time, and one of these examples was accidentally rediscovered by divers 2 years ago. Since the equipment was often deliberately destroyed to keep the enemy out of their hands, finding such a machine is always an extraordinary thing, no matter how hard it may have been from decades in the water. Secret message. Speaking of encrypted messages, back in 2012, Briton David Martin was busy cleaning up his Surrey home, but as he was sweeping out his chimney, the mortal remains of a long-forgotten World War II veteran suddenly fell out in front of him. But no, these were not human bones, but the skeleton of a small carrier pigeon. The special feature on the bird's leg was a red capsule containing a coded message. However, since nobody knows how to decode the message anymore, we also do not know which commands or information were lost back then. What caused the carrier pigeon to become entangled in the chimney is also uncertain. After the find became known, some pigeon friends suggested honoring the feathered veteran posthumously with the Dickon Medal. So far, this highest British award for animals is still a long time coming. Firearms. Have you ever heard of magnet fishing? As the name suggests, this special form of fishing uses a magnet attached to a string to retrieve metal objects from the water. In some countries, such as France, magnet fishing is prohibited, and the legal background has not finally been clarified in this country either. The main dangers of this practice are that old war weapons and ammunition are often fished, which can develop into deadly catches if handled improperly. Fortunately, however, there were no serious incidents in 2018. At that time, magnet anglers came across a sunken arsenal of weapons in Warwick, England. First, the anglers spotted a revolver, followed by a submachine gun. The family also found several other firearms in the area. It is believed that these once belonged to a British soldier who no longer wanted the killing instruments after the end of the war. P-40 Kittyhawk. It is June 28, 1942, when pilot Dennis Copping steers a damaged P-40 Kittyhawk to a British base in Egypt. However, the then 24-year-old was never to achieve his goal, and for 70 years everyone wondered what fate might have fallen him. In 2012, an employee of an oil refinery managed to rediscover the missing machine in the middle of the Sahara. And indeed, after all that time in the desert, the Kittyhawk was still in remarkably good condition. However, there was still no trace of Dennis' remains. However, the makeshift parachute deployed indicates that the pilot was attempting to shield himself from the relentless desert sun. In desperation, the young man probably set out on foot into the endless desert to reach his base before thirst, heat, and exhaustion brought him to his knees. City of Cairo. Despite being a British passenger ship, the city of Cairo was attacked and sunk by a German U-boat on November 6, 1942, without warning. More than 100 people lost their lives during the sinking. Since the scene of the accident was 1,600 kilometers from the mainland, it took weeks before the lifeboats were finally found. In addition to the passengers and the crew, the city of Cairo had more than 7,400 tons of cargo on board, including cotton, iron, and last but not least, 2,000 crates full of silver coins. As the world public learned in 2015, the wreck had already been tracked down in 2011, and the silver treasure with a value of 50 million euros had been raised. With a depth of 5,150 meters, the city of Cairo became the deepest shipwreck in history. Gigantic mine. Garden owners know it is important to spruce up your own green space from time to time, especially when a 250-kilogram sea mine from the Second World War is discovered while sorting it out. Unbelievable but true. After the deadly explosive device was found in a humble garden in the Australian state of Victoria, it became the property of an antique dealer. After the dealer had secured the find, he transported it to his shop, and without further ado, on the back of his car. Luckily, the makeshift ratchet straps kept the mine from falling onto the street and doing worse. To save the shopkeeper's honor, it should be mentioned that at this point the explosive weapon was no longer active. In fact, many of these explosive devices were defused after the war and turned into small incinerators into which yard waste was dumped. The Rabbit's Revenge. In 1807, Napoleon was at the peak of his power. During the Fourth Coalition War, French troops had succeeded in bringing Prussia and Russia to their knees, who then became unwilling allies. To duly celebrate this military political bang and to cuddle up properly, Marshal Louis-Alexandre Berthier decided to invite the mighty emperor of the French to a rabbit hunt. For this reason, Berthier had brought in thousands of long-eared rabbits. But when the hunt for the little victims was about to begin, the tide turned. Instead of fleeing, the released rabbits targeted Napoleon and his companions. Faced with around 3,000 attackers, the men didn't know what to do and panicked. Then they began repelling and hopping army with whips, sticks, and their rifles. Napoleon even firing a few shots. After more and more animals had bitten into the emperor's pants and jacket, the celebrated general had no choice but to retreat in a carriage. The story goes that Napoleon then threw the last of the rabbits out the window. According to the story, Berthier had received domesticated animals from a breeder. When they saw the people in the open field, they rushed towards them, hoping to be fed. Instead of dusting off delicious carrots, however, the fluffy attackers won what is probably the most curious military victories in history. The longest war in history. The war between the Netherlands and the British Isles of Scilly lasted an incredible 335 years. The curious thing, in all of this time, not a single person was killed, not even a shot was fired. Whether the war took place at all from the point of view of international law has not been conclusively clarified. If acknowledged, however, this would be the longest and bloodiest war in history. In 1651, the Dutch demanded heavy reparations from the British on the Isles of Scilly for lost ships and cargo. Since the request was rejected, the Dutch Admiral Tromp declared war on the Scillians. Shortly thereafter, the two parties to the conflict were able to come to an agreement, but the Dutch forgot to reverse the declaration of war. This only happened on April 17, 1986, and thus exactly 335 years after the war broke out. While the war may have ended quite some time ago, it's still surprising to see that the two countries simply forgot to settle their differences once and for all. So folks, and now we're interested in your opinion. What discovery from the military world surprised you the most? Do you know of any unexpected war discoveries that we didn't mention in today's video? Feel free to share your thoughts, suggestions, and feedback with us in the comments. Also, don't forget to leave us a like and subscribe to stay up to date from now on. And with that, thanks for watching. Take care and see you next time.